Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to make this presentation. I want to thank Orijit and Marie-Laure, and I also was very pleased to hear the Dean. Dean Pierre is what I would call you, since in the Singapore fashion. To hear your words. I mean, I thought I was intrigued enough that a business school would want to look at globalization and geography, and listening to these two eminent professors and their interests, I was quite struck. But hearing you and saying that it's time to think of and to push through a different, not just business model, but economic model in order to become more sustainable is really inspiring. And I wonder if this kind of thing can still only happen in France. But we wish you all the best, and we will be with you. Okay, so you can see the title, Globalization and the Transnational Region. And let me just go, oh, the other way, I see. Okay, so I'm going to try and quickly go through. I can read this better here directly, so that way you can follow me. Globalization, according to some, has of course have flattened the dimensions, some dimensions of the world, and I think that is true. And we have seen that coming from a place like India. We can see how that has happened, but obviously by no means all, and that's a truism by now. So, but it is, I think, very interesting to look at what kinds of novel spaces appear when you get this new type of interaction between virtualized spaces and geography, when they begin to combine anew. What kinds of spaces happen? What kinds of, in fact, choices are available? What kinds of moral choices and community choices and so on, I think is something to be able to, that I'm going to try and think through at the end. If you're not here at the end, that's okay. You'll have this PowerPoint. Now, there are two aspects to this that I'll talk about. One is the empirical issue, where we see, interestingly, something that had not been anticipated is the emergence of regions since this recent round of globalization in the last 30 years, right? Regions have emerged very strongly after the Cold War. You see, Europe, of course, is the best example, although that was sort of bubbling along for a while. You see NAFTA, you see Mercosur, you see in Africa, ECOWAS, and all kinds of, and the Black Sea region and so on. The American Historical Association is having us do some, I'm editing a pamphlet series for them on regions, and I was amazed to see how many people submitted all kinds of regions you would never think of, including between Spain and Argentina and parts of Brazil, and how they, I see Saskia is laughing. You must have very close knowledge of those regions and ethnic groups and economic ties that link and are relinking those kinds of areas. So this is, and of course, what I'm going to talk about, parts of Asia, in particular, what I call Maritime Asia. Theoretically also, in relation to the question I posed earlier, what kinds of new boundaries does this transnationality, this round of transnationality entail? Because it has, of course, a strong technical dimension to it, which I think does make a difference. What are the possibilities and problems in these emergent or re-emergent regions? And I'll tell you in advance, two slides of conclusions. One is conclusion one, opportunities. Conclusion two, dangers, right? Or problems. So now I'm just going to go through a little bit of what the situation was before this round, and I talk about space, just formulaic stuff from Lefebvre and people. That space in the 19th and 20th century was dominated not just by capitalism, but for me also by the territorial imperialist nation state. A capitalist space is very clear. is when you want some kind, these spaces have the capacity for commodification. They're abstract, standardized, exchangeable, secured by property rights, and as Saskia told us yesterday also, they are capable of being securitized and financialized and derivativized, or whatever you call those kinds of things, right? That I'm sure you all know about. But the thing is that this space is also bounded by territorial boundaries controlled by states, especially nation states, but not only. And what they do, and this is an old sociological truth, first established by Ernest Gellner, they seek to create a congruence between territory and culture, or territory and identity. That is the basis, of course, of national consciousness, which I consider the ur-form of identity politics. The nation state, in this whole 19th, 20th century period, the nation state and capitalist space are pretty continuous and collaborative, so they work with each other. But there was also a very important tension within them, and that was the tension between the deterritorializing urges of capital and the need for, by the state, to contain it through territorial boundaries, through its territorial boundaries, through territorialization. This, of course, we see, in some ways, one could, a Marxist view would be that this is to contain imperialists and capitalists from coming into your territory, and that was the basis of developing nations and so on. But it can be also many other kinds of things. Now, something clearly has changed. Nation states and global capital are now much more collaborative, and there are all kinds of ways in which the territorial boundednesses of these things are being bent and overcome as limits. And as we also heard very clearly from Saskia yesterday, this has moved the tension. It has displaced the tension, I think, away from the boundaries of nations, where in fact, in some ways you could say that earlier the people who were expelled were pre-expelled, right, by boundaries of nations. Now they're erupting from within the system. So let's see how much. I don't think that's happening, of course, entirely, but it's an important trend in what is happening. Now let's move to certain historical issues, which is, since that is what I am, and it's my bread and butter, that's what we'll talk about. So, but to think of how regions are formed, they are, of course, not always a consequence of globalization or capitalism or economic forces. You have the formation also with certain minimum economic sort of movement, natural, economic, and intellectual networks that form across regions. You can think of how even before Christianity, Buddhism, and so many other old ancient religions moved and created networks. And it was not clear which was creating which. I mean, economic networks were facilitating them, but they were often taken in order to engage, in order for trade to flourish as well. And there is what is the process known as regionalism, which is the efforts to create a region by political and other forces. Now, Asia, we all know, nobody wants to romanticize this, was a name that was given by the Greeks to the area east of the Ecumene. Mainly they had the Achaemenids, the Persian Empire, in mind, but this was the region. You interpolate those names and it becomes one for you. And it really, for most of its history, was no more than a cartographic entity. But of course, as I've said, there were connections within these territories through trade and religious connections. You did the maritime area, which I want to talk about a little bit, not so much as a model, but certainly as an exemplar of a certain type of pre-modern economic activity and cultural activity that made linkages, is the networks of Asian maritime trade between 1300 and 1850. Now, actually, it goes much before that, when, in fact, you had the whole region from the Red Sea to the South China Sea that was very well developed. And, those of you who have been in Singapore for a while will see the exhibition of an enormous Arab, actually it wasn't that enormous, but the cargo it was carrying from 900 AD or CE, as we now say, it was a ship from the Abbasid Caliphate, but it was bringing back the Tang cargo from the Tang dynasty in China, and the shipwreck shows that China was very much the industrial workshop of the world. There are tens and tens of thousands of porcelain customized in Arabic calligraphy and so on and so forth, that is supplying a huge market that was there already before the 1000 CE. And you have very high value gold products and other things that came from different parts of this. This is on exhibition, and a museum with which I'm on the managing board, the Asian Civilization Museum, is building, in fact, a special branch to house this as its permanent collection. So I think it's actually, for me, it really gave me a very concrete sense of what this Asian maritime trade was. But a lot of it after a lot of this trade was actually enabled by, of course, the most ruthless conquerors of the world, the Mongols, who once they stopped being ruthless, unified a world system. Abu Lughod talks a lot about this, the pre-modern world system that joined these different regions all the way from East Africa to Quanzhou, which is in Fujian in China. Now, and this became dominated later by the Chinese tribute system, which sought to create some kind of order in this region, very differently from the way in which the US creates order in the world system today, or does not fulfill its function, but similar to that kind of thing, and for which they also sent out, the big Changhao maritime expeditions, which were the largest ships in the world in the 1400s. Now, of course, there were also all these business communities that flourished in this area. And they were Arab, there were Baghdadi Jews, there were lots of Indian, Gujarati, precisely that region, Kerala. You have, of course, the Southeast Asia, you have the Bugis, and the Malay principalities, and the Chinese, of course. And later on, the Japanese and so on come in as well. Now, according to Janet Abu Lughod, all this was really... rules of the game were changed when the Portuguese came, because they came with state power to do trade, and they came with guns and military power, and changed the games of the Asian maritime trade system. And gradually, and it took a while, it was not until 1780s or 1800 that European dominance came to play a role in this area. And even so, even when the East India companies, the Dutch, the British, and the French, and so on, dominated these regions, they still depended very much on the pre-existing networks of trade, of the Chinese. And the ones to survive these were the Chinese from Fujian area, the Gujaratis, and some Tamils, and the Baghdadi Jews, whose trading communities not only survived, but basically a lot of the European trading firms rode on their networks, utilized their information systems, and their very elaborate trading practices by which they had these, the carry-forward trade, the long-distance credit networks, and so on, through which they could penetrate parts of East Africa and so on, that expanded, in fact, during this time. And by the time, and this is some very famous Japanese work on this, called this whole area has become, once you get the modern Jardine Matheson and all of these modern Western companies begin to dominate the finances of this region, it becomes interfluent with these older networks, right? So it's called cross networks. It says kosa netoaku. Cross networks of Chinese and Indian financial groups who are sending remittances and other businesses and so on. And this is what explains places like Singapore and Hong Kong, by the way. But of course, before Singapore, there was Malacca. Now, I have a feeling many of you don't know where Malacca is, but so this was the monsoon and maritime. You can see how this was actually, a lot of it was naturally based, because it's the monsoon winds which bring in into the South Asian and the Southwest Asian region in July, and then they come back into, this is Singapore and this is Malacca, just north of it, a 3-hour drive today. Malacca was, in fact, the hinge, the entrepot. So basically, Chinese merchants would bring their goods here in January and then wait and exchange their goods. Indian and West Asian merchants would then move when the monsoons allowed them to move after 6 months. And so this was the pattern for a good 7-8 centuries that developed there, and upon which, of course, European trade also developed. And what one of the interesting things is that, of course, what Raffles, the founder of Singapore, did was to move the entrepot from Malacca to Singapore, because it had a much better harbor, was much better, more defensible, and there were pirates, there still are, as you know, on the straits. And so this then, of course, led to the rise of Singapore. So Singapore is very much central to this whole Asian maritime trade, and part of what I'm suggesting is that in some ways we're coming back to that formation. So the British Empire is another phase of this regionalism, is also linked, as you know, let's go back to the map. All the regions from Aden, as you see, you know where Aden is, the Red Sea, to the Gujarat region, to Kerala. Then, of course, Calcutta was a big center for them. Then Singapore. And then you go all the way around what they call the country trade, which is along the Southeast Asian coast, all the way first, of course, to Canton and Hong Kong, and then ultimately to Shanghai. And that becomes, of course, the range of the British Empire in this region, and then ultimately the whole system was unified so that goods in Rio de Janeiro could be standardized to a certain extent that they can be exchanged in Shanghai, right? So for that, but the British had to do a lot of work for that. They controlled the Chinese Maritime Agency for about close to a century, about 80 years or so, from the 1850s to 1930s. And we don't, people think, oh, they just control the customs because the Chinese government couldn't control it. But in fact, what they were doing was they were collecting information and creating an infrastructure for world trade. They were standardizing weights, measures, currencies, all of these things. Of course, the Chinese merchants still had an advantage because they could use both the standardized as well as the non-standardized modes, And perhaps a lot of the people could do that kind of thing as well. So they could get goods from Rio de Janeiro and also prevent foreign merchants from penetrating Chinese markets, right? So, there were all kinds of advantages that were here as well. But nonetheless, this created the basis for a lot of movement of goods, trades, a certain standardization, which is also important, I think, for this kind of regionalization. So all this is happening. I then moved to a next stage only because it is an important, I wrote a whole book on this next stage, but I'll mention that is the Japanese Empire. The Japanese tried to take over this whole Asian regional system that the British had developed to create their co-prosperity sphere, the ultimate goal of which, of course, was to get to India, take over India, and move on to the Middle East. So they had dreams of world empire in the interwar years. And we won't go into the details of all that, but they created a very important model, which for the first few years was actually, the Indonesians, the locals, everywhere outside of China were initially very welcoming of the Japanese because they had gotten rid of colonials, right? Of these foreign colonials, and it had a devastating impact on Western imperialisms in this part of the world. They could never regain that kind of stature. And I'll tell you an example of what the Japanese did in Hong Kong. When they put the British officials in Stanley, which is a back part of Hong Kong Island, they put them in this camp, which is basically a concentration camp. And then they got rickshaws, which they made British administrators pull and put Chinese and Indians on the rickshaw, right? So, I mean, there are all kinds of symbolic statements and so on that they were making as well, appearing as champions of Asia and this, that, and that. Well, very soon, you know, the imperatives of war made it clear that these guys are not going to be any better than anyone else. And it's the structural form that's the problem, right? So, but they did try to create this new rhetoric of theoretically sovereign and equal nation states. And I have called this the imperialism of nation states, which I think becomes developed very much during the Cold War as well, because that is how, in fact, the US and the Soviet Union did operate. Theoretically equal, it was the imperialism. It was the big brother imperialism, right? But military control you had, but you kept the rhetoric of nation formation. So anyway, so the Cold War was a time when you had some regionalization. You had Seattle, you had ASEAN, you had CENTO, you had Seattle, and all of these things. But of course, it was a supra-regional. It was a supra-regional competition of two powers that did not have a geographical propinquity as such, was not very important. I also talk a little bit about what happens with an anti-imperialist regionalism that develops, which is mainly an intellectual movement. And Arijit, you were right. It's, of course, dominated by Bengalis, right? Who actually had no real awareness of the real movement of people, goods, and so on that was taking place during this imperial period. In fact, very few people have actually worked on this so far. Now, more and more people are doing it. But the whole Asian actual flows of people and goods and so on in this region in the 20th century. But these guys were, of course, into their high culture and all their cultural influences and ancient Asian connections and so on, which we're also a little guilty of. But it was completely divorced as it was. It did produce some excellent art, which art and culture. Tagore was one of the most, in non-leftist circles, which is relatively small in China, he was one of the most popular figures in the early 20th century, and there were whole societies and culture movements and so on that were founded around him. This is Cuomo Roh, one of the greatest intellectuals of the People's Republic of China, and Shudramo and people who were very keen on Tagore's work as some kind of liberation for Asia and civilization ideals as opposed to modern Western ideals and so on. Many of those ideas are coming back. You see here, these are two Bengali artists. One is a cousin of Rabindranath Tagore, who are very influenced by Chinese and Japanese styles of art, which become deeply influential throughout Indian art. And then you see Japanese artists here trying to experiment with different Asian styles of art and so on as well. All this is, of course, happening with this Pan-Asian regionalism and so on, which is, of course, always tied to global ambitions, right? Ambitions of globalization. And the story of power and idealism, of course, is a whole different subject. Now, let's talk about the contemporary period. How am I doing? I should move faster even. So things change, of course, in the late 80s with the Washington Consensus, 1989. You know all of these things. But for Asia, one very important, which leads to liberalization and neoliberalization in many of these societies, but a very important development, a landmark for Asian regionalism, to the extent that it has appeared, is the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98. And it's a landmark for various reasons. Not only is there great disillusionment with the whole, what is it called? The IMF policies of, what are they called? Restructuring and so on. But also, China comes. This is China's move into Asia. China disagrees not to devalue its currency, right? Because otherwise the things will become much worse. And gives a lot of aid and so on, makes certain initial gestures, which really lasts for a good 10, 12 years. And that sort of gives a very important fillip to Asian regional connections. Now, as we know, as is happening in the rest of the world as well, there are different efforts to regionalize Asia. You have APEC, which is supported by the Americans. You have various Japanese programs. Then you have ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 6. Now it's become ASEAN plus 8. And then you have the East Asia Summit, in which India is also very involved. And so you have, and so what I did, a lot of the core study of this is based on an Asia Development Bank report of 2008, which I think is a landmark report, which studies 16 economies, including Hong Kong and Taiwan. You cannot call them countries or nations, but it includes those two. It also includes India and 10 ASEAN countries. And what you have is a very clear marking point between what happened before 1998 and after 1998. Before 1998, as I show here, trade between Asian countries is only 33%. This, of course, is a massive reduction from the Japanese and the British period, when there was a lot of inter-Asian trade. But in the Cold War period, it came down to 33%. After 1998, it goes up to 52%. My sense is that today, I haven't had a chance to go back to the figures, it's probably close to 70%. Of the trade of these places. I mean, excluding China, because China is, of course, trading with the whole world, but the rest of China. And, of course, 70% of the rest of Asia's trade is with China. So that also makes a difference. Now, the basis of integration here is what you've been talking about, the, what do you call it, vertical supply chain, global, what, GSC, right? As GVC, okay, yeah. So that is very much the basis of this kind of integration, and you can imagine good produced in China is not completely produced in China. There are different parts, different capital, different labor, and so on, get made in different parts. Of course, financial integration has been much weaker, and but there is more and more of a common fund, the Chiang Mai Initiative, which is now up to $120 billion with all kinds of swap deals and so on. Of course, there was also a floated idea for a very long time, and very strongly a floating idea of an Asian currency. Ever since the euro, nobody has been talking much about it. So that's in abeyance at the moment. But there's also been a lot of movement of people, cultures, the whole Korean wave in Singapore, Japanese anime, Bollywood cinema in so many parts of Southeast Asia. And in China today, Bollywood cinema is also very big. And it's very interesting to go to a place like Angkor and see that the main investors are Japanese and Koreans, and increasingly Chinese, because it's such a South Asia, Southeast Asia type of art form. So that's also something very interesting to see here. Of course, we've, from Saskia and other people's talk, we've heard about how the movement of capital has been taking place, the financialization. Also, won't have time to talk about how the role of new media in this kind of interconnections. We see also, since the very interesting, Asian art. So in high culture, you have a lot of developments, and Asian art values are being pushed by art entrepreneurs. They're probably also heavily financialized at this point. And they, too, conduct lots of inter-Asian art exhibitions and so on. But, of course, the most significant for us to focus on, I think, is to talk about migration of people. And Asians within Asia have migrated a lot. The PRC has 30 million migrants, most of which are in Asia. India has 20 million, which is mixed. I mean, there you have to include a lot of West Asia. Philippines, 8 million. And a lot of the migration is from, as you'd expect, developing Asia to developed Asia, right? And you can see here in Singapore, 1/4 of the population is foreign, or more maybe. But the second type of migration, of course, is relatively new in the world, and that is professional networks, professional migrations, right? Migrants. And these are new important phenomena and are a part of greater Asian intercity linkages. I think that's very important. The Dubai, Mumbai, Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tianjin, Tokyo to the extent that they let them. These Asian cities are increasingly becoming linked by capital, by professionalism, by labor, as well as by models. You know, the Singapore model is being looked at everywhere. The Dubai model is being sort of worked at. Shanghai is now becoming a very important model for many different Asian cities and so on. It's amazing. There's a city in Indonesia which replicates, I forget which one it is, it's a small city, which replicates Singapore. It even has a Merlion and a whole thing out there, right? Do you know which one it is? No, Sembawang or something like that. And so there is a kind of a flow here that I think we should be attentive to. But of course, this is hardly comes free of problems. The most important kind of relationship, I think, is between this kind of elite migration and working class migration, and I think it's very key. And you see it very, in Singapore, you see it very clearly. On the one hand, you know, I'll show you some pictures, which will tell you, oh, by the way, this is a migrant protest in Korea, and the one reason I have this picture is that some of these slogans are in Bengali. Now, they're Bangladeshi workers in Korea, but they're printing. I mean, I can imagine now in Tahrir Square you have posters in Chinese and so on, but in Korea you have these in Bengali. Is quite an interesting phenomenon to try and understand. This is the professional class migrants, right? So this is, you can't see this picture very well, but there are people from various different young Asian nationalities from different parts of Asia, and this is the kind of place that they work in, which is Fusionopolis, Biopolis, and so on, which are just around the corner here. High-tech, biotech sort of industries and so on, or labs, I should say. And of course, while these people are working inside them, the people who are working around them are also Asian labor, but from a different class, right? So you have this whole relationship, and how that relationship is going to be negotiated is going to be critical to whatever understanding of Asia we have. So, and to put it very simply, basically, this kind of stratification of Asian space is made possible also because, of course, of the nation-state system. It's absolutely because of the nation. Nation-states are welcoming and generous towards emigrating and immigrant professionals like myself, I guess. I won't implicate others. But continue to control labor migrants very closely as in earlier periods. In fact, even more closely. Labor migrants are, in the words of Agamben, still the exception, utilized by capital with little or no rights in the host country. They're often the whipping boy during bad times. And right now we have some of the most interesting, one of the most pathetic cases here, the Rohingyas, right, who have been pushed out of Myanmar. I think we can now call it Myanmar, and are circulating between these different Asian societies, and they're being trafficked, they're being sold and resold, and end up with nothing. So these are the kinds of, this is Singapore migrant labor. So let me come to some of my conclusions. I have about 4 more slides, I think. Regions are important because globalization produces wealth, I think we know, but at the same time, it produces stratification and overconsumption of resources. Regions, I think, permit smaller clusterings of sovereign or semi-sovereign agencies to tackle spillover problems from this. Migrant labor problems are, of course, a very major issue in here, and they have to be addressed regionally. Of course, there are, of course, huge migration problems that are internal to countries like China and India and elsewhere, but the transnational ones are actually, in some ways, very difficult because they don't have any agencies of care, as it were. They don't have any status from a modern political perspective. You also need some kind of regional agencies to coordinate common and linked problems of regional public goods, right? Climate change, public health, environment, all of these kinds of things. And of course, the most important issue here in Asia is the issue of water, as many of you know. And we know that the Himalayas, we heard a paper earlier as well, has the watersheds of about 10 major Asian rivers. So I was surprised to hear that China was the source of only 6% of the world's rivers, of water. Now we have multiple dams. The Mekong, this is older information, has 3 dams and many more planned across several nations. You have the Newjiang, which we talked about, also has, which is the Irrawaddy and Salween, is planned about 25 dams. The Yarlong Sangpo, or the Brahmaputra, which goes in from Tibet into Assam in India, which is where I'm from, and into Bangladesh, for which a huge population depends for their livelihood. And there is, of course, also a Chinese project to divert the waters from the southern rivers to the north, because North China is becoming increasingly desertified. And so that will also create problems. There were some very interesting politics of this north-south diversion and the Indian side, because the Indian side made a big fuss that when you divert the water from the Brahmaputra, this is going to lead to water wars among nuclear power. But in fact, most of the water that comes into the Brahmaputra, into South Asia, comes in after the Chinese border in Arunachal Pradesh. So from the glaciers and so on. Of course, these glaciers are also melting. So, but the problem is that any dam construction there, in the case of an earthquake, will have devastating effects all the way downstream, And earthquakes are not just something that could happen, but will happen. It's just when and where. And so these are very serious issues that need some kind of, as I will try to suggest. And here is some issues of dams and so on. And we heard today a more positive study of how these dams could be soft power. But I think more than anything else, the international community and the Environment Committee is deeply distressed. Just yesterday, I got an email from China's one of his most important environmental researchers and leaders, Li Bo, who said that he had invited him to our institute for a few months. He said he couldn't come because the new 12-year plan in China has reversed all the achievements of Chinese water NGOs for water conservation and water preservation. They are even reversing the reversed dam projects that Poshila and others had decided on. And so all these dams are going to go through at this point for China's energy needs. And I don't know if this is soft power or not. Certainly environmental NGOs in China. And so he couldn't. He's writing a report called The Last Words of the Chinese Rivers. Right? This is going to be an internationally circulated, probably be a UN World Bank kind of report as well. So, I mean, this is, and of course, this is not just a Chinese problem. This is a problem everywhere. I mean, India, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. You have within Laos, Cambodia, on the Mekong, and all of these kinds of things. So these are real issues that require some kind of what I call shared sovereignty, some kind of understanding that sovereignty cannot be absolute, that you need certain regional agencies that need to develop it. And here is my little romantic pitch. I think that what has happened is that there is a kind of a regional core that is emerging or had emerged and is now in a bit of trouble. But that is emerging, and that is ASEAN. I think ASEAN has been, ASEAN is well known for being, relatively third world, not being very efficient or effective and so on. But it has succeeded, I think, in drawing, has become a magnet, drawing all kinds of global powers around it to create some kind of centers for new models of experimentation as well as other politics. So their idea is not a balance of power strategy. They could never do it. They are small countries here that are together. But it does not take sides. It has rather, its strategy is to enmesh. It's a strategy of enmeshment through of the major powers in the region through commercial diplomacy. Now, everyone has been falling over backwards to have FTAs and all kinds of, whether in goods, services, industries, and so on, in ASEAN. And this is, right now, India, which had done, of course, China has a full service FTA with ASEAN, and of course, the results came even before You can see the figures. I'll just show you down there below. But India is now also doing a service FTA with ASEAN, which had a lot of problems trying to implement, but it's become this. In ASEAN, there is a very clear hierarchy. The US remains an important great power. It's very important for its militaries. It's the China of the tribute times, right? And below that, China is the next big regional power. Then Japan and India occupy the next rung. And what they had got, remember I talked about how China had been very important for ASEAN in 1998. And they had got, over the next 8 to 10 years, China to sign some things like the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation and so on, which it was very much an expression of Chinese intent to cooperate and build a regional architecture in the region, in this area. But something has happened in China, and nobody really fully understands what is happening. China is not certain whether it's committed to this ASEAN architecture anymore. Ever since the FTA in 2009, already South Korean exports to China jumped 94%, Taiwan 91%, even Malaysia jumped by 53%, right, in that 1 year. Of course, partly it was the financial crisis in the West. But then, at the same time, you have a situation where China is no longer that supportive of ASEAN regional architecture. And there are all these problems, as you know very well, with the South China Sea and the whole Asian region. And China is turning its attention to other areas. So this is something I think that is very well worth considering when we think about regionalism. So, okay, final conclusions. As I said, we'll talk about opportunities and problems. Asian regionalism is emerging differently from older national model of territorial homogenization. So this conflation that I talked about with Gellner is finally beginning to see some kind of separation of this conflation. I think it's not even clear whether in Europe there is a, Balibar made this point a while ago. He says that, it's not clear whether Europe is going to emerge as a supra-nation or something different. It's clear that in Asia, nations are not going to be given up easily, but there'll still have to be different formations. We know also about elite business professional groupings, including, I should say, NGOs are very important in my model. They form networks of interaction. The region is constituted by these nodes of interaction, right? Especially in the Asian cities. The region is thus not territorially conceived, but by the density of interactions among different nodes, to the extent that we can talk about this as a region yet. And in that sense, it resembles much more the older Asian maritime networks and is much more bottom-up from that perspective. Now, the network concept does not require outside territorial boundaries, but it requires a certain faith in interdependence, right? Therefore, I mean, identity does not appear as holistic or essentialized, but much more situational, right? And so this, in a sense, is, and if you look at the virtualization that has happened, that has enabled this and continues to extend this process of networking and so on, virtualization and flat world, I think this is, in some ways, can extend the network beyond known boundaries and expand possibilities, as is happening and more with all these service agreements and this, that, and the other, right? And and in many of these cases, of course, nation states are involved, but nation state structures are not necessarily always involved in the problems of regional cooperation and problem solving. Many political administrative agencies have appeared from bottom-up coordination. I think a very good example of this is the Mekong Delta coordination, which is having problems, but nonetheless, it has emerged and developed in very significant ways. And I think we need, this area, places like Hong Kong and so on, have become the hub of NGOs and civil society, and Taiwan, Hong Kong, many of these Chinese areas, actually, are now among the leaders, and there are increasing linkages between these groups. Okay, now let's go to the problems. If this kind of formation can potentially break the identity-territory conflation, responsible, I think, for so much nationalist strife, It does produce, of course, other tensions and contradictions. We've seen how state-capital collusion and network elites create new class conflict over dispossession, migration, especially, as I said, transnationally. I think one of the most important problems, of course, that it has created, this new round of globalization, although it precedes it much more, is the impact of the environment. And I would like to say that here is where geography comes in. I think the environment continues to be very much a physical, geographical factor. And no matter how much you virtualize, these geographical issues reassert themselves. They catch up with you, right? Politically, the condition of transnational exploitation of people and resources, but continued pursuit of national interests and national framework for justice creates a very mismatched and untenable situation. There's a very interesting environmentalist activist, Mutsuyoshi Nishimura, who was the fellow who actually worked out the Kyoto Protocol in the first instance, chief climate negotiator of Japan. He has come up with a project of a carbon budget, which is well known. I mean, it's not just him, it's lots of environmental groups. 600 billion gigatons of CO2 between 2010 and 2050. And these carbon credits would be controlled collectively by government, which is a proposal that I find very interesting. Carbon credits are to be auctioned off on a polluter pays principle. And he also has handicap provisions for developing countries who need to develop their economy. So in many ways, it's a win-win proposal. I think most environmental specialists would agree. But despite enormous global support from all of these agencies, his plan always faces what they call national mitigation obligations from developed and developing countries. So China will not do it because the US has to do this before it can do anything. And the US, as we know famously, didn't even sign on to the Kyoto Protocol, right? So what do we do? In an ideal world, I think, since people do ask questions about what is your solution here, I decided to add this. These problems could be addressed by, I think, very strong civil society development, formations with the capacity, and I think the Greens are a good example in Europe, a capacity to pressure nation states to compromise on sovereignty, deal collectively with the region, and ultimately global issues. For these, we need new sources of self-formation beyond consumerism and nationalism based on new ideals of transcendence, by which I essentially mean environmental sustainability. Okay, thank you.
Well, that was a great talk. You have me thinking here. And I have many questions, but I'm just going to give you one because otherwise it's just... So I want to return to what you were describing somewhere in the middle of your presentation, this emergent Asian regionalism. Yes. And so I've been thinking about these new kinds of assemblages of elements, where they deborder established institutional closures. Yeah. And I have one very... Ooh, this is much light. I have one particular issue that I would like you to address, perhaps. So in the research that I'm doing, I keep running into, yes, borders, so a geography of borders, which can also move inside the country, of course, etc. But the other thing is bordering capabilities. And so this has become for me a question, who has the power, the capacity, the positionality, it can vary, to make borders? Because, if you want these private networks of finance where most of financial trading happens, they make borders. They cut across the traditional borders. And there are very weak regimes like fair trade, the system, not the movement, that also create sort of, these... And again, I sometimes use the language of informal jurisdictions if I want to name what is being formed. But the question to you really is, in this region, which is so complex, so many countries in there, bordering capabilities. Who has the power to make new types of borders?
Yeah, no, of course, Saskia, you have been the most important person, at least for my thinking, and I'm sure for many other people's thinking, on this whole issue of, you know, when we were initially thinking of how with globalization nation states will disappear and so on, I think you had one of the best answers, that no, the nation state can globalize sufficiently by reconfiguring how borders are created and so on. But I think you're right that at this point, I mean, you know, the simple-minded answer would be that basically multinationals dominate this area, even these areas. But I think you're right that they don't, because even when they create special zones and so on, you have new agencies that come and renegotiate these borders, right? I mean, there's a whole informal labor between Batam and Singapore and the Malaysian border and these kinds of special zones as well. You know, there are all kinds of different kinds of community building, which also means different kinds of bordering. Tourist agencies, you know, tourists often, they are told to stay out from the industrial regions of these Singapore's resort areas because they're often on the same island. And so on, and there's the whole prostitution networks and so on that come. So these people are also making their own borders in some way. So in a sense, this is up for grabs, although there are dominant agents. I think the Chinese example is very interesting. You know, I have written this, not my own research, but there is the Yellow Sea region, right, of China, which is bounded by Shanghai. Let's just talk cities. Shanghai, Dalian. Who's from Dalian? Somebody's from Dalian. Yeah, there you go. Dalian, Incheon, Korea, and Fukushima. Very importantly, Fukushima in Japan. I mean, I'm talking about the 90s now. This is probably declined. So this border region became developed as a kind of a free trade or a very active trading zone with some special statuses. When Fukuoka wanted to create an international airport, Fukuoka had given up on Japan because it used to be part of the older national system. When Japan became transnational, Fukuoka became a periphery. So it said, we'll start our own. So Fukuoka has its own Asian civilization museum. It has its own Asian this, Asian the. Yeah, and it's not as nice as Nagasaki, but it is the real actor. And what it did was it could never get an international airport from Tokyo. So it pressured Shanghai and Shantung to pressure Beijing, to pressure Tokyo to get the airport. And the relationship between these cities are not mediated through the national government. They are mediated through sister city things, right? Taiwan business in South China is conducted through associations. Just Taiwan doesn't have embassies and things to deal with anybody. They deal with, I'm sorry, Catherine, you know, you deal through professional, including specialized women's business associations, you know, that deal with Chinese business associations and women's associations. So they're creating their own, I don't know how it's being authorized. What is the regime here that enables it? So it's a really interesting question, and I think it is up for grabs. And though, of course, you know, you do have the state can always stop it, and multinationals can always buy it out. But, you know, but there is this underlife, this infrastructure of border creating, which I think is one of the most exciting. And I don't think it's necessarily a negative thing, you know, because through this, I think you get new types of notions of sovereignty and belonging and mixed belongings and so on as well.
Yeah, Professor, thank you for the presentation.
Yeah.
I guess I will kind of narrow down my question to the interpretation of history, because I feel that in East Asia, so far we see that history is a victim of the subjective interpretation by many countries. And in many cases, South China Sea, you see that China is heavily dependent on the historical rights, which is a little bit ridiculous because it seems telling people that the ancestor is selling on this water, so it belongs to me. Doesn't matter the ancestor is kind of 800 or 1,000 years ago, you know. And the disagreement between China and Japan about the massacre history back in World War II. So you see all these cases, the historical data is not really neutral. It's kind of distorted and serving the regime's interests. And perhaps it's kind of natural because strengthen the legitimacy of the regime. I will give you a last example of how history becomes a handy instrument to kind of strengthen the regime, but not really kind of reflect the fact, which is just in the very beginning when the Chinese new leader take over the place, he's kind of talking about the past glories of China. And there are a lot of interpretation, but my reading is like CCP is now in a serious crisis of legitimacy of ruling. And history becomes an easy way for them to kind of telling people, yes, we are still the ruling party, and we have all kind of legitimacy grounds to rule this country. But it can be very dangerous for a ruling party if you have nothing but just cling to your historical past memories. So as a historian, how do you see this phenomenon?
Very unfortunately, you have asked me a question on which I have written so much that I'm not sure that I can give you a concise answer. But let me just give you the basic version that I perceive. I think in some ways, I think in this area, in this whole Asian region right now, the only actor is China. Everybody else is responding, right? And there are 2 or 3 things about this. The first is that China has a very different system of legitimacy than most other countries in this region, which is that it is not representative, right? So that this nationalism plays a different role in China than in many other places. Now, I think reactive nationalism in Japan and so on then reproduces this kind of thing, right? And so, starting with that, I make the second point that, it is precisely this peculiar, this mismatch that we are seeing in the world today that is also afflicting at the heart of the main issue of China and Asia, which is that, on the one hand, it requires all this economic relationship, especially with Japan and other parts, but it has unleashed, it still uses nationalism and seeks to fine-tune nationalism, the regime, to such an extent, but it cannot really control it as much as it would like, because the Frankenstein's monster has been unleashed. And, and you want to use it, but you also don't want it to go too far. Can it do that without it turning on itself, right? So this is, I think, a tricky problem, which is a particularized expression of the larger mismatch of globalization. Because, ideally, I mean, the Chinese government would like all that Japanese business and capital to continue and wouldn't want this. I told a story to some of you yesterday. I'll just repeat it for you. In 2005, there were anti-Japanese riots in Shanghai, right? What happens? By late 2005, early 2006, what's it called? Huatong Shifan Daxue in Shanghai, which is one of the most interesting universities, although it's a normal university, generated these textbooks for Shanghai because it has a municipality that can conduct its own education, with a high school textbook with no reference to Mao Zedong, no reference to the Nanjing massacre, and so on. Within a year, of course, they had to pull it out, not because of the government, but because of the blogosphere, who was saying, next we'll have Shanghai women taking Japanese names and Shanghai men marrying Japanese women. I remember these 2 comments on the blogosphere. So, so it's a very tricky situation at this point. Yeah.
I had a question regarding, because you mentioned sustainability,
yes,
and environment. And, well, this is a hunch, and I would want to hear what you have to say about it. It seems to me that still there is a possibility of people altering their lifestyles.
Yes.
Lifestyles of consumerism.
Absolutely.
And as I look around, it seems to me, I don't want to comment on whether people in Asia have more humility, in the sense that, well, they have a tendency to surrender to a larger kind of destiny. But it seems to me that people are at least willing, probably, to change the lifestyles. And what about, we talked about nations and regions, which is at a very high level, but from the ground up.
Yeah.
Do you think it is still possible to alter lifestyles?
Well, that may be the only hope we have. You know, it cannot happen by expecting every individual to do it. You need certain critical agencies in the world, you know, that pick up this and pressure governments to then establish policies and so on. So I was very pleased to hear your dean talk about changing the business model. I think this is one way in which things can happen. And frankly, I don't think Asians have shown themselves to be any better than Westerners had been about consumerism and nationalism. I think right now it's with certain European and Western environmental movements and so on who have been most successful and who we should be still modeling ourselves on. I would love to hear people's opinions on the Greens and so on. So and the Green movement as such, but.
Thank you so much. It was really a wonderful talk. I would like to come back to, some of the contradictions, because obviously this is full of contradictions, and in a sense that's what our world is all about. Yeah. And one of the contradictions is a bit the story about China using some of this political history to turn political and to recreate some form of national sentiment. And probably this is happening all over the place in other Asian countries, Asian nations. So we have, still this. So the nation state is still strong and kicking. Much, On the other hand, I really like the idea that actually there seems to be a bit more success in the Asian region of disentangling territory and culture compared to Europe in particular. Yeah. But I'm wondering at that level whether one of the explanations for that is not a bit the last mover advantage. In business schools we generally talk about the first mover advantage, but in a sense here it would be the last mover advantage in the sense of the last mover into the nation state games. Europe being full of old nation states, as George W. Bush famously said at some point, and young nations being in a sense less entangled into this interconnection between territory and culture, and being therefore more able to differentiate them. And something that why I'm saying that is also because even in Europe you do feel some of this, but it's much more difficult. But you do see some of those dynamics that you were talking about, the connection between cities and the recreation of kind of in the south part of Europe between Barcelona, between Marseille, and you have some of these types of dynamics, but it's much more difficult. Clearly the nation state is still much stronger as a kind of both territory and culture. But I'm wondering whether it's qualitatively different. Yeah.
Maybe you can talk of it as a first mover disadvantage, right, rather than last mover advantage. One of the arguments that I'm making in a book that I'm writing right now is that European nationalism began as confessional nationalisms. It was really, if you don't have to just read Carl Schmitt to see that, he thinks sovereignty is the transfer of that political sovereignty is the sovereignty of God in the nation, But there's a big argument that's emerging. I've just summarized that argument to in fact talk about this contrast. And of course, the Asian situation is one where they've had such a hard time, partly because they didn't have these confessional faiths, which bounded cultures with political sovereignty, right? Cultures have always been autonomous. They've been imperial formations. China is the exception in a different way. And so there is that. And so in a sense, it's harder for Europe to sort of move out of that. It's much more in its historical DNA than it was. So it's not just first and last, but it's also the nature of, here these Asian countries are trying very hard to become sleek nations, and so on, and they find, they're popping out in all directions. And then the timing issue gives them some advantage. So turn this into an advantage kind of thing. But I think it would be very interesting to see in the European case is, of course, not just Greece, but Turkey, which is still very interested in joining Europe, but Europe is still not very interested. There's a specialist on Turkey here somewhere, right? Where is she? She's gone. Okay, yeah.
Well, I would like to ask you a question about China and its relationship to Asia. As you have bracketed China in your talk, you said, I'm going to talk about Asia, but China is not. So one question that I would like to ask is the relationship of the Chinese minorities in other countries to China on the one hand and to Asia, as you have outlined it? And the second question would be, if you look into the future, well, if you, you know what I mean. No, but
nobody's going to hold me.
Exactly. So you were just speaking about the water problem and the way China deals with it, and if you project it into the future, is there any way in which China could be brought to take into account the externalities it is imposing on its neighbors?
Say that again, the externality? What?
The negative externalities it's about to impose on its neighbors due to the water policies you've outlined.
Well, I think it was very interesting that Marie-Laure said that, when you were talking about soft power, it says this is more hard power that China has, If you control people's water source, it's better than military power. But your first question about Chinese ethnic groups in particularly this part of the world, I think it's very interesting. I think there's a huge ambivalence. I think suddenly a place like Singapore, I think, has developed, and in many other societies too. Though, of course, when these things are fluid at different times. For instance, during the Cold War and so on, so many Thais and Indonesian Chinese could not have their Chinese names. They could not use their Chinese names. They didn't know their language. They didn't even know their Chinese names to the extent that somebody had given them all this. But all this can also be reversed quite easily and sort of interestingly. But I do think that there's a very strong ambivalence. On the one hand, and Singapore, I think you see this very clearly. On the one hand, there is a sense that this is a great power and we are a nation, a separate nation with a separate destiny. On the other hand, there is great pride, ethnic pride, right, in China having been so successful in so many ways. And there's an ambivalence towards the great power mentality that China occasionally also displays, right? And one of the interesting debates in this area is to what extent is China really an old-style Asian imperial power and a modern national power, and a great power. And so I think in that there is an ambivalence. But, when push came to shove, Singapore said, no, the most important power in this region is the United States. So, there's political and cultural, I think. I could say that could be one way of distinguishing, which would be a very interesting separation of that culture-politics conflation, right? Anything else? Okay.
We want to thank you really very much again.
You're welcome.